A lot of people don't know this, but during the Middle Ages, while Europe was in the Dark Ages, Islam was having a golden age. It was a period of cultural, economic, and scientific flourishing in Muslim history that lasted from the 8th to the 14th century. And it's most commonly associated with the Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled over a vast territory from Spain to India. The heartland of this empire was in the city of Baghdad, which became the largest city in the world at the time and was also known as the City of Peace. In this episode, we are going to focus on one aspect of the golden age of Islam, and that is science and knowledge. If you want to know about the other aspects such as trade or art, then make sure you stay tuned for future episodes. Let's get started. So the Abbasid Caliphate reached its peak under Harun al-Rashid, who many of you may know from the famous book series and movie franchise 1001 Nights. He built an enormous palace library containing over 400,000 manuscripts. But his successor, Al-Mun ibn Harun, took things further by turning the library into a proper institution for research, which was named Dar al-Hekmah, or the House of Wisdom. The Caliph appointed a committee of scholars to run the library and invited scholars from all over the empire to come to Baghdad and do research there. He even sent agents abroad to bring back scientific and philosophical works from distant lands. Soon it became the intellectual center of the Islamic world and possibly the world at large. Scholars from all over the world came to Baghdad to use its library, and many of them were given salaries and housing by the state. Among them was an Iranian mathematician, astronomer, and geographer named Al-Khwarizmi, born in 780 AD. He was brought up in Central Asia, in the city of Khwarizm, which is where we got the word algorithm from. Algoritmo means the study of the calculation of unknowns using numbers and rules. And that is basically what algebra is. So Algoritmo gave the world algebra, but he also helped us understand our place in the universe. In his book, The Image of the Earth, he calculated the circumference of the Earth quite accurately, using a method that we recognize today as spherical trigonometry. But he didn't just repeat the work of Greek scholars like Ptolemy, because he also made significant advancements in astronomy and geography. For example, he calculated the length of the solar year more accurately than any other scholar before him, and he also gave us the coordinates of more than 1,000 stars. He literally mapped the night sky. He even wrote a book on how to determine the direction of Mecca from anywhere on Earth, using only the latitude and longitude. But if you think that sounds complicated, then check out his other book, The Compendium of the Description of the World. There he gives us detailed descriptions of more than 2,000 places from Iraq to Spain to China. So basically the whole Muslim world. Using the coordinates and measurements that he recorded, we can still use them today to find locations and draw maps. Thanks to Khwarizmi, the science of geography was born. But algebra, astronomy, and geography were not the only subjects that Muslims excelled in. In medicine, they made significant advancements too. A few centuries after Al-Khwarizmi, a Persian scholar named Ibn Sina lived in Central Asia in the city of Bukhara, which is where the term algorithm comes from. He was a child prodigy, and by the age of 16, he had mastered the entire corpus of Islamic theology and law. But he soon shifted his attention to philosophy and medicine, becoming the leading physician of his time. His most famous work is the Canon of Medicine, which was a compilation of the medical knowledge of the Greeks, Persians, and the Arabs. It was used as a textbook in European medical schools for over 500 years and was only superseded by modern medical texts in the late 19th century. Ibn Sina also wrote a book on logic and was considered a leading philosopher of his time. In fact, he was considered a rival of the great Aristotelian scholar Averroes. Another Muslim philosopher, Al-Farabi, was also very influential in the Latin translation movement, which I'll talk about later in this episode. But let's first talk about optics. Alhazen, whose Latin name was Akindus, was a brilliant polymath who was born in Basra, Iraq. He was possibly the greatest physicist of his time. He made major contributions in mathematics, astronomy, and music theory, but his most famous work was on optics. In his book, Book of Optics, he explained how vision works by light rays entering through the pupil and the lens of the eye. He showed that these rays are bent and focused on the retina, creating an inverted image. He also discovered that the apparent brightness or color of an object depends on the amount of light that it reflects. Now, just to give you an idea of how revolutionary his ideas were, Galileo didn't rediscover these facts until 600 years later, in the year 1604. Alhazen also gave us several important geometrical theorems, including the law of reflection. By studying shadows, he was able to determine the size and relative distances of the sun and the moon. But that's not all. His work on numbers and equations laid the foundation for modern arithmetic. He also studied musical harmony and determined the correct number of string vibrations that produce pure musical tones. So as you can see, Muslim scholars made tremendous contributions to various fields of science and knowledge. They preserved ancient Greek and Roman texts and translated them into Arabic. Then they built upon that existing knowledge and made new discoveries. But how did they do this? How did they manage to have such a vibrant intellectual atmosphere that allowed so many brilliant minds to flourish? Well, the answer is libraries. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was just the tip of the iceberg. There were many other libraries scattered throughout the Muslim world, both public and private. The most famous ones were in Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and Toledo. In fact, at one point, Cordoba in Spain was the most literate city in the world with over 75 libraries and 100 schools. Muslim scholars would regularly visit these libraries to borrow books. They would then return the books after they were done with them, so that others could benefit from them. This system ensured that knowledge was shared and spread throughout the empire and beyond. Speaking of spreading knowledge beyond their borders, Muslims didn't just preserve Greek and Roman texts, actually translated them into Arabic so that more people could access them. This process of translating Greek and Roman texts into Arabic is known as the Latin translation movement. It began in the 8th century and lasted until the 12th century. During this period, thousands of books were translated from Greek, Persian, Indian, and other languages into Arabic. Some of the most important works that were translated include those of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, Archimedes, and Ptolemy. These translations were not only important for the Muslims themselves, but also for the preservation of classical knowledge. When the Muslim scholars began to decline in the 13th century, many of these translated texts were lost. However, some of them survived and were rediscovered in Europe in the 12th century. This rediscovery sparked what we now call the Renaissance, which was a period of great cultural and intellectual change in Europe. So in a way, the Muslim scholars of the Golden Age of Islam helped lay the foundation for the scientific revolution in Europe. Now, it's important to note that while the Abbasid Caliphate was the center of the Golden Age of Islam, they were not the only ones making scientific and intellectual contributions. Other Muslim states, such as the Buyids, the Seljuks, the Fatimids, and the Ayyubids, also made significant contributions. The Fatimids, for example, had a special interest in astronomy and built several observatories. But in general, the achievements of the Golden Age of Islam cannot be overstated. It was a period when Muslim scholars made significant contributions to mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, medicine, and geography. They preserved ancient Greek and Roman texts and translated them into Arabic. This process of translating texts helped to spread knowledge throughout the empire and beyond. And it also played an important role in the preservation of classical knowledge. When the Muslim scholars began to decline in the 13th century, many of these translated texts were lost. But some of them survived and were rediscovered in Europe in the 12th century. This rediscovery sparked what we now call the Renaissance, which was a period of great cultural and intellectual change in Europe. If you enjoyed this episode, then make sure you subscribe so that you never miss another episode. And as always, thank you so much for watching.